additional motor units. Remember, recruitment happens at the level of an entire motor unit. So if you recruit motor unit X, you're going to recruit all the fibers that that motor neuron is innervating. Okay, and as such, we can generate additional force by recruiting more motor units. So this goes on to speak about the different types of muscle that we have. All right, now if we're doing smaller, more delicate, fine movements, such as the movement of the eyes, the movement of the fingers, we recruit a smaller motor unit with smaller neurons and a smaller amount of fibers. All right, if you're looking at more strenuous activity, muscles like the biceps, the triceps, the hamstrings, the quads, they're going to be associated with larger motor units. Okay, we're going to speak about the size principle on the next slide, but really understanding the difference in the type of movement of that muscle, right, and the amount of strength that's required for that muscle will determine the motor unit. Right? And so we recruit in that order. We're going to recruit according to the amount of strength and the size of the muscle that we need for the activity that we're doing. Ready? If you think about different types of muscles, so if we consider, for example, the size of neuron that would be innervating the hamstring muscles, right? We saw the sciatic nerve in the lab this past week. The sciatic nerve is a big nerve. It has a large diameter. Okay, it has large cell bodies. It has a large axon, and that is associated, right? That's going to correlate with the size of the muscles it's innervating and the strength that's required in those muscles. So the sciatic nerve innervates some bulkier muscles that require more strength, and so there's that correlation of strength and the axon diameter and cell body size. So on this slide, we're going to correlate those three things. So the number of motor units that is associated is going to differ in various muscles. Smaller motor units for smaller movement, larger motor units for larger, more strenuous movement. The fiber diameter is also going to vary depending on the strength of that muscle or the requirement of that muscle. Smaller muscles, smaller fiber diameter, if you took one single muscle fiber of a muscle and it had a smaller diameter, you could automatically associate it was going to perform a weaker movement or weaker function. If you look at the diameter of muscles of the eyes, if you look at the diameter of muscles of the hands or the fingers, right? And the same is true for larger muscles that provide more force. If you look at their diameter, it's going to be much bigger, much wider, right? Larger diameter. Let's look at the axons that innervate those muscles. We also see this correlation. And as I just mentioned, if you look at the size of the sciatic nerve, it's much bigger. It has a larger cell body. It has a larger axon diameter. If you look at the cross-section of that axon, it's going to be thicker, it's going to be wider. And that is indicating it is going to be associated with a larger motor unit. It's going to be associated with a muscle that has a larger fiber diameter. And it's going to be associated with bigger, more forceful, more strenuous movement. Alrighty. So the motor unit size is associated with the fiber diameter, is associated with the axon diameter, and all of that correlates to the function of that muscle. Now, in talking about the regulation here again, we talk about the size principle. So we don't just recruit randomly, haphazardly. We recruit in order of size. So we're going to recruit the smallest motor unit that has the smallest amount of fibers attached to it first, before we recruit larger motor units with a larger number of fibers attached to them. All right? And that is the size principle. And that makes sense in terms of the efficiency of the body. The body is going to work in a way that is most efficient, most effective, and larger neurons are harder to depolarize. They're bigger. Right? It's going to require more energy of the body to depolarize a bigger neuron to threshold. And so we don't depolarize bigger neurons unless we absolutely have to. So we recruit in order of size. Smaller motor units with less fibers attached to them first, then larger motor units with larger amount of fibers attached to them. And you can see that here. Okay, so this is a motor unit X. It has 3 fibers attached to it. We'll recruit that first if we need additional force, if we need additional tension or strength to overcome a load. And then if that's not working, we recruit a medium-sized motor unit followed by a larger motor unit. And then the last thing we're going to speak about today is the velocity of shortening. Okay, this is another factor that changes as the load changes. How quickly does that muscle shorten? How quickly can you contract that muscle? And what we'll see is that the latent period, we spoke about what the latent period is. Can anyone remind us what the latent period is? What is the latent period? Sure, Jackson?
Oh, never mind.
Anyone else? What's the latent period?
It's a period just before the muscle contraction.
So that first period of muscle contraction, we're not generating any force in the latent period, but we are allowing calcium to get into the cytoplasm, to get close to that troponin and to interact with troponin in order to initiate muscle contraction. So it's sort of a warm-up period. So the latent period is going to increase as the load increases. This makes sense, doesn't it? If you're lifting a heavy box, a full box, it's going to take more time to actually get all the calcium you need to generate the force to lift that heavier load. If we're lifting nothing, if you're lifting something very light, a pencil or a pen or paper, the latent period is almost 0, right? Because you don't need much force, you don't need much time to get calcium in to start initiating phosphorus cycling. So as the latent period increases, so does the load, or in the opposite direction. As the load increases, the latent period increases. All right. The second factor here is that the duration of shortening decreases as the load increases. All right, this is another thing that we can draw on from an everyday example. You're trying to lift in an empty box, you can lift it pretty quickly, and you can hold it pretty quickly. So your muscles can contract for a longer period of time if you're lifting an empty box. If you're lifting a full box, you're not going to be able to sustain that contraction as long as you would if the box were empty. So the duration, the period of time with which you can keep that muscle contracted is going to drop off as that load gets heavier. That's why when bodybuilders lift those heavy weights, the heavier they get, the least amount of time they can actually keep them suspended. Right? So it can be like a brief period and then they have to put them down. Whereas if it's a lighter load, you can keep that contracted much longer. The final factor here is the velocity of shortening, okay? The velocity of shortening. And as the load increases, the velocity is going to decrease. So we spoke about the duration of shortening, but how fast can you lift up a heavy box versus how fast can you lift up an empty box? All right, and that's the inverse relationship there. As the load gets heavier, the speed with which you can lift that load is going to decrease. Okay? And that's depicted in this graph. So if the load is 0, you have the maximum velocity. You can lift an empty box pretty quickly. And as the load becomes increasingly higher, the velocity will eventually drop off until this is a load that you cannot lift until the velocity is 0. Okay, so there's that inverse relationship between load and velocity of shortening, how quick that muscle can shorten.